Audio made possible by www.jackettome.com. Audio Fanfiction Productions presents Wide Awake. Fanfiction written by Angskata003. Fanfiction inspired by the Twilight Saga written by Stephanie Meyer. Chapter 38. Poppy Dip Darkness. Bella's point of view. Hours passed tortuously as I lied in my bed crying. It was only the second time ever I had actually laid in it. It was uncomfortable, plushy and full and warm and just awful. I wanted Edward's bed. I knew every lump and spring in that mattress, and how to lay on it just the right way so that my hip bone wouldn't dig into the bed uncomfortably. But with mine, it didn't matter where I laid on it. I tried the left side and the right side, but Edward and I didn't have sides of the bed. We both met in the middle. And now I was lying in the middle of mine, and trying to just imagine him right there beside me. It wasn't working. Sometime during the morning the sunlight had eventually filtered through the window, but it still felt so dark. And quiet. Eerily quiet. I couldn't hear anything else in the house, because my room was separated from the living space. Close to the kitchen, that I wasn't allowed into after 9 at night anymore. I was supposed to be in this awful room after that time. Locked away in the dark and the quiet and longing for another room and another bed that felt so close yet so far away. Hours and hours passed, and I didn't have a clock, but I could feel the seconds ticking away and the sun beginning to set as evening fell. I stayed under the blankets, and even though my bladder was screaming at me, I was irrationally afraid to uncover my head. After what felt like hours, I heard a soft rap on my door. But I didn't call out and I didn't get up. Part of me was just being spiteful and angry over the non-punishments. But another, possibly far more significant, part of me was just scared. I didn't know what I was scared of, because I knew that this room was fundamentally safe for me, but I couldn't shake the absolute feeling of unease at the thought of rising from the warm spot my body heat had created under the safe cover of the blanket. Whoever knocked eventually left without entering the obscurity of the room. I had to pee so badly that I was rocking under the blanket and squeezing my legs shut, but I could feel the dark and I didn't want to venture into it. Time passed, and no one came to check on me or ask me if I was okay after that first attempt. It made me furious, and it made me relieved. I figured if I was being forced to stay in this room, then I should be able to wallow and cower in solace. I did. Wallow. Cower. Alone. While I lay under the blankets, I began wishing for Monday. As me couldn't stop me from seeing Edward at school, surely. Then I remembered how she had given instructions to the school administration that Edward could tend to me in the event of an emergency. Then I worried and panicked that such permission could be rescinded. I had no idea how far she was willing to take this whole thing. I spent my time trying to put the pieces together in my head, mostly trying to figure out how Edward and I could still make this work. Thinking about those things allowed my attention to remain away from the fact my bladder was painfully distended, and the fact that the room had become entirely dark from above the covers. I think I was trembling, shuddering, crying. It was so dark and quiet, and just when though I might go absolutely insane lying in this foreign bed, I heard a tap on glass. It made a high-pitched shriek escape my mouth as my hands went to my hair and I pulled. Curled up tighter. Rocked harder. Silence once again invaded the room after the soft tap, but I shook more violently under the blue cotton and poly blend. And when I heard the window slowly slide open, scrapes of metal and wood, my heart was thudding so loudly in my chest I thought I might need medical attention.
Bella?
I heard a familiar velvety whisper from feet away. Edward. And then my whole body, stiff with hours upon hours of tension, relaxed so extremely, I thought my bladder might empty right there on the mattress. Instead I flung the blankets off my head, and sat up in a simultaneously swift motion. There Edward stood right outside of my open window with his palms flat on the sill, and his upper body leaning over it and into my dark room. The sheer curtains were fluttering lightly in the breeze from outside. He narrowed his eyes against the darkness to find my wide, disbelieving gaze from where I sat on the large bed. Once our eyes met, his face transformed into an expression of relief, shoulders hunching under the leather jacket he wore, and a sigh escaping his lips. He smiled tightly while lifting his leg over the sill.
"Thank fucking God this is the right room,"
he breathed while climbing inside. It had occurred to me that Edward had never actually been in my room before, but I was still quite surprised and relieved to see him here now. It took me a moment to register that Edward was here. My hands were still trembling as I climbed out of bed, and did a really embarrassing half-sprint, half-dance across the plush white carpet to the window, while still painfully aware of my bladder situation. His left foot had just made contact with my floor, when my body met his with an eager force. I was afraid momentarily that I might knock him over and alert the house to his presence. But he was just as eager as I, and he met the force of my embrace with an intensity of his own, crushing us together while our arms wrapped around each other fiercely. He squeezed me tight, bringing a hand up to cup my head, and press it against his neck, while I inhaled deeply. He was taking in large gulps of my scent as well from the top of my head, and really testing the durability of my bladder against his grip, but I couldn't find it in myself to protest. I could vaguely detect the scent of cigarette smoke on his black leather jacket as I breathed him in, and it took me aback for a moment, because I hadn't seen him smoke in months. "I'm so sorry," I sighed dismally into the cold leather. Because I still felt responsible and crappy, that of all the nights we had to get caught, it was the one night we decided to make love. I could feel him shaking his head, as his lips made contact with my hair. He hated when I apologized, but I had to. I could imagine his eyes narrowing as he held his lips to my head. We stood for many moments in my open window, just embracing and smelling, and probably dreading the foreseeable future, because we both likely knew that the sleep was gone now. The sheer lilac curtains that had been pulled aside grazed us in tender ripples as we embraced. I was wondering if it were possible to do this every night.
"I can't stay long,"
he whispered softly into my hair, after a few moments, stroking it gingerly with his fingers, while they began fluttering down my back.
"I just wanted to make sure you were okay."
His cheek came down to rest on my head, as his fingers played in my hair. I nodded into his chest, but didn't let go. I didn't want to let go, and I wanted to tell him I was fine, and everything was okay. But he'd never buy it, because I was such a dreadfully awful liar. I wanted to nuzzle my way into his warmth, and crawl inside of him and never leave. But there was this other issue, that I could finally take care of. I pulled away, cursing my biology, and squeezing my knees together. "Can you stay here for a second?" I asked timidly while my arms were still somewhat locked around his waist. He furrowed his brows at me but nodded, looking a little disappointed, as my arms finally released him and I stepped away. I sent him an apologetic grin, and turned quickly, taking the 15 strides to my bathroom door, in 5 because I really had to pee. On the way to the bathroom I passed the closet, and I cringed a little, walking as far from it as possible while moving past it with more haste. Once I entered the bathroom, I rushed, shutting the door quickly, and dancing my way to the toilet. It took me forever to release the full day's contents of my bladder. I could hear movement in my room from behind the door, but it was quiet enough that I was sure Esme wouldn't hear. I furrowed my brows at the sound, wondering what Edward could possibly be doing, and began washing my hands. Unfortunately, one glance in the mirror was enough to make my smile fall. I hadn't even brushed my hair, since the shower with Edward and it had dried in the most horrendous fashion, sticking up every which way and looking quite untamable as I stood in the same pajamas from the previous night. I was going to take the time to brush it out, but I glanced longingly at the door, biting my lip, and impatiently turned away from the mirror, and exited the bathroom. My eyes immediately began darting around the dark room in search for Edward once the door was opened, but my gaze fell upon a sight that made my shuffling footsteps halt abruptly as I exited the bathroom. Edward stood with his back to me in front of my closet, staring at the door, and rubbing the back of his neck, while his long, slender fingers mingled with the dark hair falling at his nape. But the door wasn't there anymore. Or, I suppose it technically was, but now it was being entirely obscured by my very large, ornately wooden wardrobe. The furniture had been a requirement for me since I never entered my closet, and refused to use it for any type of storage, clothing or otherwise. I stood awestruck, gaping at the sight, as his head slowly turned to meet my gaze once again. I smiled incredulously as I slowly made my way to him, quite impressed that he had somehow managed to move the large piece of furniture all on his own, and so silently at that. But the look on his face made my smile fall as I neared him from where he stood motionless in front of my closet. He looked distraught as his hand continued rubbing his neck, and for a moment I was concerned the exertion of moving the wardrobe might have hurt him, but his eyes convinced me otherwise. The darkness of the room cast shadows over his face, and emphasized the tight lines around the edges of his eyes as he watched me approach. I had seen this expression before. On Thursday, though the rage was replaced with anxiety and glum. I moved between him and the wardrobe, and put my arms back around his waist without hesitation. "Thank you," I mumbled sincerely, burying my face into his chest, and squeezing his waist tightly. Somehow he always knew what was bothering me, and I felt so crappy because I couldn't ease any of his anxiety or glum. He cleared his throat while bringing his arms back around me.
How pissed is me?
He asked in a clipped voice that made me sigh, and burrow deeper into his chest. Because this was probably an understatement where Edward was concerned. I began relaying to him the events of the morning, while I held him firmly, as if I could keep him here in this room for the rest of the night, or possibly hang on so tightly that he would be forced to drag me home with him. He remained silent, while I explained the non-punishments in a hushed whisper, seeping spite and utter disdain. And by the time I was done with the recount of Esme's tirade, I was endlessly curious as to his own confrontation with Carlyle, and figuring the argument they likely had was the cause for his distress and anxiety. I waited with bated breath in the silence of the room for him to offer me the information willingly, hoping there was something I could do to soothe him, even though I knew there probably wasn't. Instead he kissed my head and pushed me away gently, his hands lingering on my shoulders, as he gazed into my eyes. They were dark and troubled, and I knew that he must have had quite a falling out with Carlyle to be so faced like this.
"If I get caught here, all hell will break loose,"
he explained, looking rather apologetic that he had to push me away.
"Again,"
he grumbled, and shook his head lightly, trailing his fingers down my bare arms and hooking them in my own while I stared at him forlornly. I still had one little ray of hope. School? I shrugged one shoulder, trying to smile and be optimistic, and probably failing quite miserably. Edward made his own attempt at being optimistic with a tight grin and nod, leaning down to give me a chaste kiss on the lips that was very unfulfilling. When he pulled back, I went with him, holding my lips to his for as long as he would allow. He smiled against my lips as I refused to release him. I smiled back, because it felt real, and not forced, and made me feel like maybe I was soothing him anyways. He didn't look tired yet, and I was thankful as we walked to the window. Slowly, ridiculously slowly, holding hands and prolonging the encounter for as long as possible. But eventually we were there, and the curtains were billowing around and beckoning him to leave, with his house looming largely outside mine. I leaned against the window frame, shivering from the cold, and biting my lip as he swung his leg over without releasing my hand. I watched him climb out completely, lithely, and I didn't want to let his hand go as he stood outside of my room and darted his eyes around the yard in a nervous gesture, licking his lips.
"I'll see you Monday,"
he whispered, rubbing my knuckles with his thumb and staring down at our intertwined hands despairingly. I stared at his face and it made my heart ache. "I love you," I choked, wishing those words could ease all of his troubles and make every problem dissipate between our two households, yet knowing no such thing was